Most people believe wealth changes because of money. That's the first misunderstanding. Money doesn't create discipline. Money doesn't create confidence. Money does. To create clarity, those things come first. The reason wealth appears to skyrocket after the $100,000 mark has very little to do with the number itself, and everything to do with what had to change inside you before that number was even possible. Before $100,000, you're trying to survive. After $100,000, you're finally learning how to operate. The shift isn't financial, it's psychological. Up to that point, every decision is loaded with emotional weight. Fear of loss, urgency, the need to prove something, these forces quietly dictate behavior. And as long as they're in control, consistency is impossible. But once you cross a certain threshold, something subtle happens. You stop needing money to confirm your worth. That's when wealth begins to compound, not because the market changes, but because you do. This is not a story about money growing faster, it's a story about resistance disappearing. The first $100,000 is not a financial challenge. It never was. It is an emotional survival test disguised as a money goal. Most people approach it believing the obstacle is strategy, opportunity, timing, or intelligence. But those are surface explanations. Underneath, the real struggle is the inability to function consistently while under psychological pressure. Before $100,000, money carries emotional weight. Every decision feels heavier than it should. Every loss feels larger than it is. Every gain feels fragile, as if it could disappear at any moment. When money is scarce, the mind does not evaluate probabilities, it evaluates threats. And a mind focused on survival cannot operate objectively. This is why people abandon plans they intellectually believe in. It's why they hesitate at the moment of execution. It's why they override rules after a loss and chase outcomes after a win. None of this happens because they don't know what to do. It happens because fear is running the decision-making process. At this stage, money is not just money. It represents safety, self-worth, validation, and the promise of relief. When an outcome carries that much meaning, neutrality becomes impossible. You are no longer making decisions. You are defending an identity. Emotional survival creates urgency. Urgency creates distortion. Distortion destroys consistency. People often say they need a better strategy, but what they really need is the ability to tolerate uncertainty without reacting to it. Strategy only works when applied consistently, and consistency is impossible when every outcome feels personal. Before $100,000, losses don't just reduce capital, they create doubt. They trigger internal dialogue. They reopen unresolved beliefs about failure, intelligence, and worth. Each loss reinforces the idea that something is wrong with you, not with probability itself. That belief is what causes hesitation, revenge behavior, and impulsive decisions. The irony is that the very behaviors driven by fear are what prevent progress. Trying harder, pushing more aggressively, increasing risk, or forcing opportunities are all survival responses. They feel logical in the moment, but they compound emotional instability. The more emotionally charged your actions become, the less predictable your results are. This phase is not about optimization. It's about regulation. You are learning how you respond to uncertainty. You are discovering how much discomfort you can tolerate without abandoning your structure. You are being exposed to your relationship with loss, patience, and delayed gratification. These lessons are unavoidable. They cannot be skipped by knowledge alone. People who quit before $100,000 don't fail because they lack potential. They fail because they never learn how to stay present in discomfort long enough for consistency to take hold. They confuse emotional pain with danger, and as a result, they keep changing direction. Every time you change strategies prematurely, you reinforce the belief that external answers will save you from internal discomfort. That belief keeps you stuck in survival mode. The truth is that the first $100,000 requires you to do something most people resist: operate without emotional confirmation. You must take actions whose outcomes you cannot control while remaining emotionally neutral regardless of result. You must accept that losses are not feedback about you, but expressions of probability. You must stop needing each step to reassure you that you're on the right path. This is extremely difficult when money feels like oxygen. Scarcity narrows perception. It makes you focus on short-term outcomes instead of long-term processes. It convinces you that the next decision must work, which immediately places you in conflict with reality. Reality is probabilistic. Nothing works every time until you accept that fully, not intellectually but emotionally, you will continue to sabotage your own consistency. The first $100,000 forces you to confront this truth repeatedly. It asks the same question over and over again: can you follow your rules, even when you're uncomfortable? Can you stay disciplined when the outcome is uncertain? Can you separate who you are from what just happened? Most people answer no without realizing it. They think discipline means effort. It doesn't. Discipline means structure that removes the need for emotional decision-making. But structure only works if you trust it enough to execute without negotiation. Trust doesn't come from wins. It comes from repeated exposure to uncertainty without self-betrayal. Before $100,000, every loss tempts you to change something. And sometimes change is necessary, but most of the time, it's a reaction, not an improvement. Reactive change keeps you emotionally busy while preventing real growth. This is why progress feels slow at this stage. Not because you're moving inefficiently, but because you're being rewired. You are unlearning the belief that discomfort means danger. You are learning that uncertainty is not a signal to act. It's the condition under which all progress happens. Once this lesson begins to settle, something subtle shifts. You stop needing to be right. You stop trying to avoid losses. You stop interpreting temporary setbacks as permanent failures. And when that happens, your behavior stabilizes. Stability is the real milestone, not the money. The $100,000 mark often coincides with this internal shift, which is why people mistakenly credit the number. In reality, the money follows the psychological change. The change does not follow the money. When emotional survival is no longer the primary objective, decisions become simpler. Risk becomes defined. Execution becomes cleaner. You no longer need to force results because you trust the process enough to let it unfold. This is why growth appears to accelerate afterward. Not because you suddenly became smarter, but because you stopped interfering with yourself. Before $100,000, you are learning how to stand still emotionally while the world moves unpredictably around you. That skill is rare. It is uncomfortable, and it is absolutely necessary. Those who make it through this phase are not the most aggressive or the most brilliant. They are the ones who learn how to stay aligned with their rules even when their emotions demand relief. The first $100,000 is not about winning. It's about not quitting on yourself. It's about proving not to others, but internally that you can operate from structure instead of fear. Once that proof exists, the game changes. Not because you escaped uncertainty, but because uncertainty no longer controls you. And that is when money finally stops being about survival and starts becoming a result. After $100,000, something fundamental changes, not in the market, not in opportunity, and not in the mechanics of making money, but in the way money is perceived. The shift is quiet and internal. Most people don't recognize it while it's happening. They just notice that decisions feel lighter. Outcomes feel less personal. And execution becomes cleaner without requiring more effort. Before this point, money is emotional. It carries meaning far beyond its numerical value. It represents safety, validation, freedom, and relief from pressure. Because of that, every financial decision is loaded with psychological weight. Gains feel like confirmation. Losses feel like threats. When money is emotional, objectivity is compromised. After $100,000, money begins to lose its emotional charge, not entirely but enough. Survival is no longer the primary concern. There is breathing room. And in that space, the mind starts to shift from reaction to structure. This is where most people misunderstand wealth acceleration. They assume money grows faster because there is more capital to deploy. Capital helps, but it's not the cause. The real cause is that behavior stabilizes when money stops triggering fear. When fear recedes, rules stop being negotiable. Structure replaces impulse. Instead of asking, how do I make more right now? The mind begins asking, how do I repeat what already works? That question alone changes everything. It moves focus away from outcome and toward process. And process is where consistency lives. At this stage, money becomes a system, not a source of emotional feedback. Decisions are made according to predefined criteria. Risk is calculated, not felt. Losses are absorbed as part of distribution, not interpreted as mistakes or failures. This is what it means for money to become structural. Structure is not rigidity. It is clarity. It defines when to act, when not to act, how much to risk, and what constitutes success. Most importantly, it removes the need to decide in the moment. When decisions are pre-made, emotions lose their leverage. Before $100,000, people often believe they lack discipline. In reality, they lack structure strong enough to withstand emotional pressure. After $100,000, emotional pressure decreases just enough for structure to find hold. This is why people suddenly feel more disciplined at higher levels of wealth. They didn't become stronger, they became less emotionally entangled. Discipline is not willpower. It is the absence of internal conflict. Once money becomes structural, risk management stops feeling restrictive and starts feeling liberating. Knowing exactly how much you can lose without consequence creates freedom. You no longer hesitate because loss is already accounted for. You no longer overcommit because the structure defines boundaries. This shift fundamentally alters how opportunities are evaluated. Instead of chasing what looks exciting or urgent, you filter everything through your system. Most opportunities are ignored, not because they aren't good, but because they don't fit. Saying no becomes easy when you are no longer emotionally dependent on outcomes. Time horizon expands as well. When money is emotional, patience feels dangerous, waiting feels like missing out. But when money becomes structural, time becomes an ally. You allow setups to mature. You allow compounding to work. You allow probability to express itself fully. This is where compounding truly begins, not as a mathematical concept, but as a behavioral one. Compounding requires consistency. Consistency requires emotional neutrality. Emotional neutrality requires that money no longer represents survival. The $100,000 threshold often marks the point where these conditions align. Another subtle change occurs here. Identity separation. Before this stage, people often define themselves by their financial performance. A good month means they are capable. A bad month means they are failing. This identity entanglement creates volatility. It causes behavior changes in response to self-judgment. After money becomes structural, performance is evaluated objectively. Results are reviewed, not reacted to. Adjustments are made calmly, not defensively. Identity is no longer on the line with each outcome. This separation is critical. It allows learning without shame and correction without fear. Without it, growth is slow and painful. Structural money also changes how effort is applied. Instead of trying to do more, people start doing less but better. They refine rather than expand. They optimize existing systems rather than constantly seeking new ones. This creates leverage. Leverage is often mistaken for scale or complexity. In reality, leverage comes from clarity and repeatability. A simple system executed consistently outperforms a complex one executed emotionally. After $100,000, people stop confusing activity with progress. They recognize that fewer, higher quality decisions produce better outcomes than constant engagement. This reduces fatigue and preserves mental capital, another form of wealth that compounds. The emotional calm that emerges at this stage is not complacency. It is confidence without arrogance. It comes from knowing that outcomes do not define you and that losses are not signals of failure. They are expected variations within a system. Because of this, drawdowns no longer derail behavior. They are managed, not feared. Recovery becomes mechanical rather than emotional. This alone dramatically shows. Art is the time it takes to grow wealth. When money is structural, feedback loops become clean. You can evaluate performance without distortion. You can see patterns without projecting meaning onto them. You can adjust without urgency. This clarity is rare, and it is powerful. Most people never reach this stage, not because they lack opportunity, but because they never escape emotional entanglement. They keep trying to solve psychological problems with tactical solutions, but no strategy can override fear indefinitely. Once fear loosens its grip, strategy finally has space to work. This is why wealth appears to accelerate after $100,000. Not because the game changes, but because the interference stops. You are no longer fighting yourself. You are no longer negotiating with emotions. You are simply executing a structure that you trust. At that point, money behaves predictably not because markets are predictable, but because your behavior is. And when behavior stabilizes, results compound. Money stops being a measure of worth and becomes a measure of alignment. Alignment between rules and actions. Alignment between risk and tolerance. Alignment between effort and outcome. That alignment is what most people are actually chasing when they chase money. After $100,000, they finally stop chasing and start operating. And that is when growth becomes not just possible, but sustainable. Wealth does not accelerate when desire increases. It accelerates when desperation disappears. This is one of the hardest truths for people to accept because it contradicts the narrative that ambition, hunger, and relentless pursuit are the drivers of success. In reality, the intense need to get rich is often the very force that keeps people poor, not financially poor, but behaviorally unstable. Trying to get rich creates pressure. Pressure narrows perception. Narrow perception leads to impulsive decisions. Impulsive decisions break consistency. And without consistency, wealth has no foundation to grow on. When money becomes the goal rather than the result, behavior becomes distorted. At the beginning, people believe motivation is the answer. They think if they want it badly enough, they'll push through obstacles. But motivation is emotional energy, and emotional energy is unstable. It fluctuates with results. When outcomes disappoint, motivation collapses. When outcomes succeed, overconfidence takes over. Both states are dangerous. The moment you need money, you surrender objectivity. Needing money means you need outcomes to confirm something about you, your intelligence, your worth, your future. That need creates attachment. Attachment creates fear. Fear interferes with execution. This is why people abandon systems that are statistically sound. Not because the systems don't work, but because the people cannot tolerate the emotional discomfort that comes with letting probability unfold. Trying to get rich fast intensifies this discomfort. It compresses time, expectations, and amplifies urgency. Everything starts to feel late, missed, or behind. Decisions are no longer evaluated based on quality, but on how quickly they might deliver relief. Relief-seeking behavior is the enemy of wealth. True wealth accumulation requires doing things that don't feel immediately rewarding. It requires waiting without reassurance. It requires repeating actions that feel boring, slow, and emotionally uneventful. The mind resists this because it craves stimulation and confirmation. When you stop trying to get rich, you stop asking money to solve psychological problems. You stop using outcomes to regulate emotions. This is the moment behavior stabilizes. Instead of forcing growth, you focus on alignment. Alignment between what you know works and what you actually do. Alignment between risk and tolerance. Alignment between expectations and reality. This alignment removes internal conflict. And where there is no conflict, energy is no longer wasted. People often confuse ambition with aggression. Aggression is reactive. Ambition, when properly understood, is patient and directional. It does not rush outcomes. It builds conditions. The wealthy do not wake up each day trying to get rich. They wake up trying to execute their process correctly. Money is a byproduct, not a target. When the process becomes the focus, pressure evaporates. Without pressure, clarity emerges. With clarity, mistakes decrease not because errors disappear, but because self-sabotage does. Most financial losses are not caused by bad opportunities. They are caused by emotional overrides, entering too early, exiting too late, risking too much, or abandoning rules. These behaviors are driven by urgency, not logic. Urgency comes from the belief that you are behind. When you stop trying to get rich, you stop telling yourself that story. You accept where you are, not as resignation, but as realism. From realism, effective action becomes possible. This is why wealth often skyrockets after a psychological shift rather than a tactical one. People don't suddenly gain better information. They gain better emotional regulation. They stop forcing trades, deals, or decisions. They allow opportunities to come to them. They wait for alignment instead of chasing excitement. This selectivity dramatically improves outcomes. Another change occurs here. Risk. Perception recalibrates. When you are trying to get rich, risk feels necessary. You convince yourself that bigger bets are required. But large risk, taken from emotional need, rarely produces sustainable results. It creates volatility, not growth. When you stop trying to get rich, risk becomes proportional. You no longer need home runs. You are satisfied with singles and doubles repeated consistently. This is how compounding works in reality. Compounding is boring. It lacks drama. It does not produce stories worth bragging about in the short term. And that is exactly why it works. Drama is a sign of emotion. Involvement. Emotional involvement disrupts probability. Wealth grows fastest when behavior becomes unremarkable. This stage also changes how failure is interpreted. Instead of seeing setbacks as signs to push harder, they are seen as data. Data does not threaten identity. It informs adjustment. When identity is no longer tied to outcomes, learning accelerates. You can see patterns without defensiveness. You can correct without shame. This dramatically shortens feedback loops. The pursuit of wealth often delays wealth because it keeps attention fixed on the wrong variable. Money is not the variable you control. Behavior is. When behavior stabilizes, wealth follows automatically. Stopping the pursuit does not mean losing ambition. It means refining it. Ambition shifts from outcome obsession to process mastery, from urgency to endurance, from intensity to precision. Precision beats intensity every time. This is why people who finally let go often experience rapid growth. They didn't become passive. They became aligned. Their actions stopped contradicting their long-term goals. Trying to get rich encourages shortcuts. Stopping that pursuit encourages patience. Patience allows probability to work fully. And probability, when given enough time and consistency, is unstoppable. Wealth skyrockets not when effort increases, but when interference decreases. Interference comes from fear, ego, impatience, and the need for validation. Remove those, and the system does what it was always capable of doing. This is the quiet truth behind sustainable wealth. It is not built through force. It is built through trust in process, trust in structure, and trust in time. When you stop trying to get rich, you stop fighting reality. And when you stop fighting reality, reality starts working with you. That is when wealth stops feeling chased and starts feeling inevitable. Wealth doesn't accelerate because you finally figured out the right move. It accelerates because you stop needing every move to prove something about you. When emotional pressure disappears, behavior stabilizes. When behavior stabilizes, probability has room to work. The $100,000 mark isn't a finish line, it's a psychological transition from survival to structure, from urgency to alignment. Stop chasing money and start executing with clarity. When fear no longer drives decisions, consistency emerges naturally. And when consistency becomes effortless, wealth stops being something you pursue and becomes something that follows.